Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Tuesday. This is Seattle Now. So far this year, 21 gray whales have washed up dead on the Washington coast. Researchers say it's an alarmingly high number. Coming up, we'll talk about why this is happening and the devastating role of climate change. But first, let's get you caught up. You might want to consider which beaches you hit up for an open water swim this week. King County Parks officials are currently urging people and pets to stay out of the water at 4 beaches: Madison Park Beach, Andrews Bay Beach at Seward Park, and Jean Coulon Memorial Beach in Renton all have high bacteria levels, and toxic algae has been discovered at the West Beach at Green Lake, so at least for now, swim somewhere else. Seattle could get another arts and cultural district. The city council will vote today to add the Georgetown neighborhood, which is home to many artists and arts organizations. The designation means the neighborhood will receive annual money and resources for arts programming and advocacy. The city council will also vote to formalize the combined neighborhoods of Columbia City and Hillman City as an official arts and cultural district, which has been operating as one since 2018. And don't throw away that Match 4 lottery ticket if you happen to buy one recently. Last Wednesday, on a single night, Jay's Mini Mart in Burien sold 20 winning lottery tickets, according to KUOW 7. That's $200,000 in winnings that haven't been claimed yet. If you did get lucky, maybe share a little of the winnings with your favorite daily news podcast. Just kidding. Not really. We'll be back with more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. Increasing numbers of gray whales are getting stranded on the Washington coast. This year alone, 21 whales have washed up dead, many of them malnourished. And that's raising the alarm for scientists who've been documenting a 7-year uptick in mortality. John Kalambakidis is a research biologist with Cascadia Research Collective in Olympia. He's been studying gray whales for 50 years. He's here to talk about what's been happening and why. John, really appreciate you taking the time.
Nice to talk to you.
These gray whales are on a long migration journey right now. Tell us about where they're coming from and where they're headed.
Yes, gray whales make one of the longest migrations of any mammal. Humpback whales are close rivals to them, but from their primary feeding grounds in the Arctic, where they usually spend from late spring through fall, they then migrate all the way south to off Baja California, usually following the coast for most of the way, and then spend late December, January, February down in those areas. And now this time of year, spring, is when they're migrating back to their feeding grounds up in the Arctic. And they've basically gone through 3 or 4 month fast where they have eaten either not at all or just very little. So this is probably the most stressful part of their annual cycle. And even in normal times, the gray whales would be expected to be thinner. But what we're seeing is some of these whales not having enough to even make it through this period, which means they didn't quite get enough of a reserve last year.
John, you've been studying these whales for 50 years. What does the condition of the whales tell you about why we're seeing so many strandings?
Yes, for a while, and we've gray whales for a long time were this success story of having come back from whaling from just a few thousand whales in the early 1900s to well over 20,000 by the time we got to the 1990s. And we hailed that. They were removed from the endangered species list, went from endangered all the way to not listed, based on that success story. And then we started to see these periods of mortality. One was declared an unusual mortality event in 1999 and 2000. In Washington State, we saw 50 whales wash up dead in those 2 years combined. So about 25 each year. And there'd been an earlier event that also seemed to have an effect on the population. And that led us to think these whales were maybe going through, as they reached the carrying capacity of the food supply, they were maybe going through a more natural boom-bust cycle. But now we're in a new chapter. This mortality event that began in 2019, we thought might be short-lived like the other ones, and we might see a recovery after a short period of higher mortality. And instead, what we've seen is it continue for this 7-year period now. And some of the news coming this year is suggesting rather than abating, in some areas it's becoming more troubling.
Yeah, what can you say about these strandings right now?
The ones we're seeing this year, the consistent finding has been they've been very thin or what we would call emaciated. We've also seen a number of animals with blunt force trauma that suggested they suffered impact with something like a vessel or a ship. We've seen some other kind of complications, if you will, but we think all of those relate to this central cause of these animals being in poor nutritional condition. And that's leading them to seek out and search for new areas to feed. And that often takes them into areas where there's more vessel traffic, more fishing activities. Sometimes it's taken them into very strange areas. Part of what got the attention in this area was in early April, we had one whale swim far up a small river, the Willapa River, that seemed really unusual. And we think that whale was, again, a whale struggling to find new areas to feed, but then maybe entering a debilitated condition as it basically starved to death that led it to lose its navigation and sense of location.
What are these gray whales feeding on? And when there isn't enough, what are they looking for?
Well, gray whales, they're sort of specialty, if you will, and what they seem to do better than any other whale is feed off the bottom. So their most typical way to feed is to go down to the bottom, turn on their side, and actually use suction to suck in the sediment, water and all the creatures that live either on top of the sediment or buried shallow in the sediment into their mouth and then filter it through these baleen plates. And for a while, and scientists, including myself, viewed these whales maybe as they had this one kind of trick, and that's what they only knew how to do. But actually, what we found is they're actually pretty versatile, and they are able to feed on other prey, maybe not as efficiently and effectively, but in terms of different numbers and species of prey, more different types of prey have been identified as prey of gray whales than any other baleen whale. So they actually can feed in the water column. They can try to feed on, herring roe in certain times where that's plentiful. They'll feed on krill like other baleen whales. So they do have these other abilities to explore other types of feeding. And in one area in Puget Sound, they've specialized on feeding on burrowing ghost shrimp. And they actually feed on them in the intertidal area, meaning areas that are high and dry at low tide. They're able to swim into this incredibly shallow water at high tide and engage in this feeding activity with barely enough water to support their bodies. But those are areas where there's some of the highest densities of ghost shrimp. And they do that remarkably effectively, gaining weight rapidly, even though they can only feed during these high tide periods.
Amazing. Now, even with this diverse diet, though, they are still starving.
Yes, and I think, as we see how they're more versatile and try to feed in other areas, it maybe is a survival strategy that they maybe have to utilize and evolve to utilize in other periods of change in their main food supply in the Arctic. But I think what the mortality indicates is these alternate types of feeding don't seem to be enough to support this level of the population. And hence, that's why we're seeing so many animals not making it. The most recent abundance estimates that came out last year, done by Southwest Fisheries Science Center, part of NOAA, estimated that the gray whale population was down to less than half of what it was just 10 years ago. So from this amazing slow recovery, now we've seen this precipitous decline in the last 10 years.
How many animals are we talking about?
Yeah, the abundance estimates in the late 2010s went from 27,000. That was their high point. The most recent estimate was 13.
Okay.
So still quite a few animals, but that pace of decline is troubling. There should be a new estimate out sometime later this year. And last year, they also do counts of how many calves are born. And the number of calves born last year was under 100, extrapolated out to the whole population. the lowest number they had seen in their entire period of monitoring. So no sign of this population decline or this low reproductive rate abating at this point.
What's the role of climate change here, John?
Yes, well, there's still lots of things for scientists to understand about all the dynamics in the Arctic, but some things are really clear. One, some of the areas that gray whales have been known to feed in the Arctic that had some of these high density benthic prey that they feed on, now the amount of prey in those areas has steeply declined, so much less prey. And those areas that were much more affected by kind of the seasonal ice conditions now have been affected by the retreat. And we're talking about not just 1 or 2 years, but over decades, the steady retreat of ice cover in the Arctic. And that's been kind of talked about for decades. We just didn't appreciate how that retreating ice could affect a myriad of other things, which include, higher temperatures, especially near the bottom where their benthic prey grow, current patterns up in the Arctic, how sediment is transported and the type of sediment, which affects what animals can grow in that sediment and gray whales can feed on. And that's why there's complications with understanding all those dynamics. But clearly the driving force has been this dramatic ecosystem change that has been most dramatically seen in Arctic waters, compared to, areas where we live. And so it's a little bit of a warning and, early sign of what kind of changes can occur with these overall climate warming that we've seen.
How are scientists approaching conservation efforts around these whales?
There are a number of things that have happened, starting with the recognition of this higher mortality rate, this declaration of an unusual mortality event, which NOAA did starting in 2019. Ironically, and perhaps by mistake, they declared it over in 2023, even though it's continued. But that triggered scientists from Mexico, the US, Canada, those that work up in the Arctic, all coordinating and working together to compare notes. That includes documenting how many whales they're seeing stranded in those areas, trying to promote and further research. So that's one thing that's happened.
Given everything we've been talking about, is it likely that we will see these strandings continue to grow?
I sure hope not. Through the end of April, we had 17 gray whale strandings. The trouble is most of the strandings in a year typically occur after that date.
Wow, okay.
So I've looked at all the other years, and we have almost 50 years of data on gray whale strandings in Washington state. The highest we had seen in any previous year through the end of April was 11. And that was 2019, that record year of strandings we had. So we were 50% higher than where we were in 2019 at that same time of year. And the other factor I want to put in, I mentioned how much bigger the gray whale population was prior to that 2019 event. We're now seeing this higher mortality with a population that's less than half the size it was back then. So proportional to the population, it's even bigger. We're still a little bit hopeful that maybe things are occurring earlier and won't extend as much into the year as it typically has and reach those record levels that we've had in years like 2019.
Okay. With that important information, maybe a little preparation for listeners. If someone encounters a stranded whale on the beach, what should they do?
Yes, really important. And this could be anywhere up and down the coast. NOAA has a stranding hotline, and most police agencies, Coast Guard, most authorities would have that if you aren't able to look it up and look up the NOAA stranding hotline number. So report it to any authority to pass on to NOAA. That's what then triggers and notifies groups like ours in different areas that are the stranding responders that then would go out.
John, this is obviously very sad. Beyond these whale populations, what are the other impacts of this to other species and humans?
Well, that is a big question, and I do think that's the one lesson and value the whales are giving us, and that these mortalities are showing us. They're telling us something very dramatic is going on with the ecosystem in the Arctic. Fortunately, we count whales, we have data on whales, but lots of other species, there isn't data necessarily even being gathered to realize these types of changes are occurring. So they do serve as, a warning to look at other changes in the Arctic, and they maybe serve as an early guide to us. Yes, the pace of these changes and climate change is happening faster in the Arctic, but that's going to happen in our area too. And if people thought maybe, oh, is it real? What are the consequences of a little sea level rise or slightly warmer water? These whales are trying to tell us that these consequences can be pretty serious. If you value wildlife, you value the outdoors, you value whales, you value fishing or hunting and other ways that you interact, then what we're seeing here needs to be a wake-up call to all of us.
Yeah, and certainly here in the Pacific Northwest, our whales are dear to our hearts. John Kalambakidis is a research biologist with Cascadia Research Collective in Olympia. Thanks a lot for taking the time.
Really nice to talk to you.
Thank you for listening. Take some time to rate the show and share it with a friend. Today's episode was produced by Andy Hurst with help from Jenny Cecil Moore and Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Vaughn Jones, Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. Talk to you tonight for Evening Headlines.